Alex had never been one for superstitions, nor had he entertained the folklore of shadows clinging to the souls of the nearly departed. Yet, as he lay there on the rain-slicked pavement, the world dimming around the edges like an old photograph, he couldn't help but feel the tickle of an unseen gaze upon his skin. It was a gaze that didn't belong to the gathering crowd or the paramedics, whose voices were becoming distant echoes. It was something else, older, colder, and deeply curious about the man who just danced on the knife edge of life and death. When consciousness finally embraced him again, it was in the sterile whiteness of a hospital room, where the only shadows were those cast by the gentle dawn. "You gave us quite the scare." A voice, rich and warm like freshly brewed coffee, broke through the silence. It was his sister, Mara, seated beside the bed, her eyes a mirror of the worry that had etched itself into her features. Alex attempted a smile, a feeble tug at the corners of his mouth, but it was a smile nonetheless. "Seems I have a knack for dramatics," he whispered, the words barely a rustle against the backdrop of his sterile prison. In the days that followed, Alex's life resumed its mundane rhythm, a stark contrast to the moment that had almost snatched it all away. But something had indeed changed, a subtle shift in the fabric of his reality that he couldn't quite place. It was during a casual glance in the bathroom mirror, the steam from his shower creating ghostly swirls on the surface, that he first saw it, a figure, indistinct yet unmistakably there, standing just a breath away behind him. Alex's heart stuttered, his eyes darting to the empty room reflected in the mirror, then back to the apparition. The room was as silent as a grave, save for the distant drip of a leaky faucet, mocking the rapid beat of his heart. "Probably just my mind playing tricks," Alex muttered to himself, a feeble attempt to brush off the chilling encounter. Yet the seed of unease had been planted, watered by the memory of that unseen gaze during his accident. In the days that followed, Alex found himself glancing over his shoulder, peering into mirrors, windows, any reflective surface, only to catch fleeting glimpses of the figure. It was always there, a silent sentinel in his periphery, never fully visible, but undeniably present. And with each passing day, it seemed to draw ever closer, its features sharpening in the cruel light of Alex's growing fear. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon when the full weight of Alex's new reality began to press down on him, as tangible as the summer humidity that clung to his skin. He and his friends had congregated in the park, a celebration of his return to the world of the living, or so they joked. Cameras clicked, and laughter danced on the air, weaving through the sun-dappled trees. Yet, amid the revelry, Alex felt detached, an observer in his own life. The photos captured on that day would later reveal his unseen companion for the first time, a blur at the edge of the frame, a smudge of darkness where light should have been. "Look at this," Mara said, scrolling through the digital memories of that day with a frown creasing her brow. "Your camera must be acting up again." Her finger paused on a particular image, the one where the figure stood closest, a mere shadow behind Alex's smiling figure. Alex leaned in, his throat tightening as he recognized the familiar outline of his silent follower. "Yeah, probably just a glitch," he lied, the words tasting like ash on his tongue. But curiosity, once piqued, is not so easily sated. That night, under the guise of solitude, Alex turned detective in his own investigation. He scoured through old photographs, tracing back through weeks, months even, and there it was, a gradual encroachment upon his life, a shadow that grew ever more defined with each snapshot of his existence. It was always there, always watching, and always just out of clear sight. The more he looked, the more undeniable it became. This was no trick of the light, no fault of the camera lens. Something was with him, tethered to him by some unseen thread. "Am I going mad?" Alex murmured to himself, the photographs spread out before him like tarot cards foretelling a grim future. Each one a step closer, each one a day less he had left unnoticed. The realization struck him with the cold precision of a surgeon's scalpel, slicing through the veil of denial he had wrapped around himself. There, in the silent communion with his own growing dread, Alex understood that his near-death experience had left him with a souvenir, a companion that lingered just beyond the realm of the seen, waiting, watching, ever present. As days melded into weeks, the figure in Alex's reflections began to adopt a more sinister clarity. What was once a mere smudge of darkness had sharpened into a grotesque parody of human form, its features twisted in a silent scream of malevolence. Alex's once safe havens, the mirror in his bathroom, the windows of his home, even the glossy surface of his phone, had all become portals of dread, each glance a potential glimpse into the eyes of his tormentor. The air around him felt heavier, charged with an anticipation that whispered of unseen watchers. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire, Mara visited. She found Alex pacing, his movements erratic, like a caged animal. "You're not sleeping," she stated, more a fact than a question. Her eyes, wide and concerned, flicked over his haggard appearance. "It's nothing," Alex replied, his voice a hoarse whisper, but the lie hung heavy between them. The room felt colder, shadows stretching across the floor like grasping fingers. The escalation of his unseen passenger's presence began to fracture Alex's reality. Reflections betrayed movements that were not his own, a hand reaching for him from just over his shoulder, a figure standing too close behind him, its breath a cold draft on the nape of his neck. Panic, raw and unyielding, took root in his chest. "It's getting closer," he confided in Mara one night, his voice trembling like a leaf in the storm. "I see it, Mara. It's there, in every reflection." But when he showed her, turning desperately to the mirror that now felt like an enemy, there was nothing. Mara's reflection stood alone, her confusion a silent echo of his despair. The nights became a battleground, sleep a distant memory for Alex. Shadows danced at the periphery of his vision, whispers filled the silence of his room, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. It was a scent that clung to his clothes, his skin, a reminder of the presence that now shared his life. Desperation led him to cover the mirrors, to draw the curtains, to live in a world dimmed of light and reflection. But the darkness was no sanctuary. It only seemed to embolden the figure, its presence now a constant pressure at the back of his mind, a whisper in the dark that promised an end to his torment, one way or another. In his quest for understanding, Alex turned to the vast, cobwebbed corners of the library, its musty shelves groaning under the weight of forgotten knowledge. The flicker of the fluorescent lights overhead cast an eerie pallor on the pages as he pored over ancient texts and modern theories alike, seeking an explanation for his relentless companion. His fingers, stained with the dust of neglect, traced the lines of texts speaking of spirits and entities, shadows that fed on the living, drawn to those who had brushed too closely with death. Each word seemed to tighten the noose of dread around his neck, a confirmation of his fears rather than the solace of explanation he sought. "It says here," Alex's voice was barely a whisper as he recounted his findings to Mara over the phone, "that some cultures believed in spirits that attached themselves to people, feeding off their life force." The silence on the other end of the line was punctuated by Mara's steady breathing, a lifeline in the darkness that was closing in on him. "They're called by many names, but the essence is the same. They're parasites, Mara, and one has latched onto me." The desperation in his voice was palpable, a tangible thing that seemed to crawl through the phone line. His revelations brought no comfort, only a deeper descent into terror. Nights were spent with eyes wide open, staring into the darkness that seemed to pulsate with malicious intent. The air in his room felt thicker, harder to breathe, as if the very presence of the entity was suffocating him. Shadows moved in the periphery of his vision, taunting him with the promise of unseen horrors. The once benign creaks and groans of the house now spoke in sinister tongues, each sound a harbinger of his unraveling sanity. The fear was a living thing within him, a beast that gnawed at his guts, leaving him doubled over in pain. "I can feel it," he confided in Mara during one of her visits, his voice a hoarse rasp. "It's like ice in my veins, a constant chill that never fades. It's drawing closer, feeding off my fear." He caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window, a pale shadow of himself, with the dark silhouette looming ever closer. The terror that gripped him then was a primal thing, a scream caught in his throat, a realization that there was no escape from the unseen passenger that had claimed him as its own. The confrontation came on an evening painted with the strokes of an impending storm. the clouds above swirling with the promise of a tempest. Alex stood in the center of his living room, the furniture pushed aside to create a clear space. The air was charged, electric, as if the house itself anticipated the brewing conflict. Alex's heart hammered against his ribcage, a frenzied beat in the quiet before the storm. "It ends tonight," he declared, though his voice trembled, betraying the fear that coiled like a serpent in his stomach. The shadows seemed to listen, gathering with a palpable intent around the edges of the room. Mara, despite her reservations, had agreed to stand by him. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her eyes scanning the dimly lit room, where every shadow seemed to harbor a threat. Alex nodded, clutching the talisman he'd fashioned from his research, a small, crude symbol of protection, its edges sharp against his palm. "I have to try," he whispered, his gaze fixed on the largest mirror, draped with a heavy cloth. "It's the only way." With a deep breath that did little to steady his nerves, Alex reached out and yanked the cloth from the mirror. The room was immediately filled with a reflection that was not their own, a distorted reality where shadows writhed and twisted into grotesque shapes. In the mirror, the figure stood behind Alex, clearer than ever, its eyes hollow pits of despair, its smile a gash of malice. "I see you," Alex said, his voice cracking. The figure in the mirror tilted its head as if amused, and then, with a jolt that made Alex's heart stop, stepped out of the reflection and into the room. The air turned ice cold, the shadows deepening until they were almost tangible. Mara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but Alex could not afford to look away from the entity that now stood before him. "Leave," he demanded, the word a mere whisper of defiance. The entity, however, seemed to grow, feeding off his fear, its form becoming more defined, more terrifying. It was a mass of shadows, its eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. The room shook, the walls groaning under the weight of the unseen battle, and for a moment, Alex feared the very foundation would give way. The entity advanced, and Alex felt the cold seep into his bones, a chill that spoke of death and the void. "You cannot have me," he stammered, clinging to the last vestiges of his courage. The talisman in his hand glowed faintly, a beacon in the engulfing darkness. With a cry that was part rage, part despair, Alex lunged forward, pressing the talisman into the heart of the shadow. The reaction was immediate and explosive, a burst of light that banished the darkness, sending the entity screaming back into the void from whence it came. The room settled, the shadows retreating, leaving Alex and Mara alone in the silence that followed the storm. In the aftermath of the confrontation, the house lay silent, a tomb of shadows and whispered echoes. Alex stood trembling, the talisman now nothing more than ash in his hand, its protection spent. The air, though free of the oppressive chill, was still thick with the scent of fear. Mara approached him slowly, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. Is it over?" she asked, her voice a fragile thread in the dense atmosphere. Alex nodded, though the certainty he sought to convey was undermined by the quiver of his lips, the pallor of his skin that spoke of deep, consuming fear. But victory, it seemed, was a fleeting illusion. As the storm outside reached its crescendo, with lightning tearing open the night sky, a sudden, sharp crack echoed through the house. It was not the sound of thunder, but something far more sinister. The mirror, the very one they had believed to be the portal for their tormentor, shattered without contact, its pieces falling to the floor like tears of glass. From within the jagged shards, a darkness began to seep, a blackness so deep it seemed to swallow the very light around it. "This can't be happening," Alex whispered, backing away as the dark tendrils snaked across the floor, reaching for him with a hunger that felt alive. Mara, paralyzed with fear, could only watch as the room dimmed, the encroaching darkness enveloping Alex, who stood frozen, his eyes wide with terror. The air was filled with a sound, a low, mocking laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that chilled the soul. "You cannot escape," the voice whispered, a chorus of despair and malice that echoed in the dark. Alex's fear had become a tangible thing, a weight that threatened to crush him. He could feel the darkness caressing his skin, the cold touch of the unseen that promised oblivion. "Fight, Alex!" Mara's voice pierced the darkness, a beacon of hope in the despair. Her words, imbued with desperation and love, reached him through the fog of his terror. With a surge of willpower born from the very depths of his being, Alex pushed back against the darkness, his voice a defiant cry in the night. I am not yours to take. In the years that followed, the house on the hill stood abandoned, its windows like blind eyes turned inward, hiding the secrets of that fateful night. The townspeople spoke of it in hushed tones, a tale of tragedy and darkness that became a cautionary whisper against the backdrop of their lives. But for Mara, the house was a gravestone, a monument to the brother she lost to a shadow beyond understanding. She visited often, standing at the edge of the overgrown path, her gaze fixed on the decaying facade, a silent vigil for the soul that had been devoured within its walls. On one such visit, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the land, Mara felt a chill, a familiar touch that froze her blood. Alex, she whispered into the silence, her voice a mix of longing and despair. No answer came, only the rustling of leaves in the wind, a sound that seemed almost like laughter. The darkness had claimed her brother, but it lingered still, patient and ever hungry. As Mara turned to leave, a shadow detached itself from the others, following her with an unseen gaze. The cycle was not broken, merely paused, and the unseen passenger, devoid of its latest quarry, was on the hunt once more.